Hi, David.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You're David Kim. You're a professor of religious studies at Connecticut College. You've also taught at Harvard and at Brown. And this semester, you've been a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, where you co-taught a course with Cornel West called Radical Love. I want to get into that a little bit. I also want to talk a little about your book called Melancholic Freedom. Boy, do I know that feeling. But first, I want to start out with talking about something you said to me when we last spoke. I asked you if you identify as a Christian, and you said, well, as I recall, you said as a Confucian Christian. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, well, I guess I would consider myself both a Confucian and a Christian.
I was going to ask which modifies which. Are you a Christian Confucian or a Confucian Christian? And I guess you're saying either none or both.
Well, yeah. First I should say Happy New Year.
Yeah, same to you.
Yeah, and I appreciate the invitation to have a conversation with you. So, let's see. I do identify as a Christian, but I also do identify as a Confucian. Sorry. The Confucianism is not so much as a kind of active religious identity, right? But it is a worldview that has shaped me from my very earliest days of consciousness. And it's hard for me to imagine the kind of version of Christianity that I live without it being thoroughly infused by Confucianism.
Okay, you were brought up Christian with Confucian influence. Is that the thing?
Yeah. Well, so let's see. How do we do this? Most Koreans, to some extent or another, experience some form of Confucianism. Whether it's a kind of obeisance to family, to tradition, certain kinds of ritual behavior. With my family, there was not an expressed commitment to Confucianism, but it was in practice. Mm-hmm. So, and this was something that I didn't really understand until really graduate school, when I first met one of my teachers, Du Wei Ming, who, I often refer to Wei Ming as the great Confucian evangelical, so, someone who's trying to revive Confucianism as a kind of contemporary modern concern. And working with Wei Ming, he introduced me to the varieties of Confucianism and, alerted me to that I had been living Confucianism my whole life, and my family had as well. And so, then when you peel back that and give texture and value and personages to the tradition, I found the Confucianism throughout my life.
So what were the elements that you recognized as part of your upbringing that hadn't maybe previously been labeled as Confucian?
Two of the principles, one being filial piety. And
devotion to your parents, or does that specifically refer to the
father?
Well,
it's not just, there are two classical forms of filial piety, one being the 3 relationships and one being the 5 relationships. For me, filial piety is a kind of commitment to those near and dear, but also understanding them as residing within an expanded network, right? So it's not just parents and not just siblings or friends, but community, sociality, or even the cosmos. Related to that is the principle of reciprocity, where it is an ethical exchange of one's humanity. Right, and an affirmation and a contribution to the humanity of others, such that it's not that it's a exchange of goods, right? But I recognize that I received gifts, as it were, from other folks, and give them back. The reciprocation of that being that their humanity, my humanity, is predicated on helping them realize their humanity, and vice versa.
Now, to some extent, you would find these in cultures generally, right? I mean, there is a notion of obligation to kin and obligation to community and reciprocity in pretty much all cultures, right? So what exactly is distinctively Confucian?
Well, I think I think you're right. I mean, there are elements of that in various traditions. But I think in Confucianism, there is, how do I put this? I find it, I guess, much more pronounced, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, sort of principles of respect. You know, and this gets, sorry, pardon me, and this gets transformed and transfigured as family relationships, right? You know, so that the reason we call it filial piety is that the kind of piousness, right, faithfulness, one might even call it loyalty that one has to family becomes not just a symbol, but a kind of a way of thinking through all of the relationships, right? So, you know, if I think about the regard and respect I have for my parents, it is singular, and yet it informs how I relate to other folks. And again, it's not just the kind of affective relationship with my parents, but it represents how I aspire to live in the world and how I aspire to relate to others in the world.
Okay.
You know, including nature, right?
Right. And now Confucianism is it's sometimes, I generally hear it characterized as a philosophy. Of course, it's assumed different forms in its history.
Right.
I've
often referred to as an ethical system rather than a religion.
Right.
Like,
although sometimes people refer to it as a religion. And I think weren't there times in Chinese history where it functioned more as a religion?
Sure.
Or am I wrong about that? So
yeah.
there have been at least Confucian temples, right?
Yep.
I don't know if there still are, but it's so. What's the status of it in your mind? It's fundamentally a secular ethical system, or is that too simple?
I think that's too simple. Well, it depends on what you mean by the secular, then,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you mean by secular where it is absent of any kind of spiritual and or religious elements, I think that's not right. You know, the Confucianism has a strong traditions of reverence. You know, where ritual is not just a mere empty act, right? But these ways that inform, again, action, responsibility, and so on. You know, there's as you know, there's a lot of controversy around contemporary Confucianism. You know, the Confucian Society sponsorships by the Chinese government of various institutes around the United States and in Europe, where, you know, is state-sponsored Confucianism, you know, the spiritual and religious tradition which I identify with? Of course not, right? Mm-hmm. But as with any, you know, and maybe all contemporary religious traditions, there's a fight going on. You know, what's the core? What's the integrity mm-hmm. of the tradition? You know, Confucianism is a tough one where, again, you know, many, you know, cultures, traditions from East and Southeast Asia are infused by Confucianism, but won't name themselves as such. Mm-hmm. Right, and so, you know, how do you be a thoughtful steward of a tradition, you know, for which many folks don't explicitly identify? Mm-hmm. You know, if anything, have a kind of antipathy toward because they consider it to be authoritarian, you know, patriarchal, and so on.
Mm-hmm. So among the reasons it's not merely a secular ethical philosophy is that there is a sense of kind of the sacred in some mm-hmm. sense.
Sure. Sacred, sanctity. But the sacred, you know, infused in religion, you know, I guess the reason I find myself identifying as Confucian is the ways in which Confucianism values relationships, mm-hmm. right? And those you know, and so much of, you know, how I think about my own work, so much of how I reside in the world is regarding the quality of relationships.
Mm-hmm. And I think in Confucian philosophy, there's an explicit connection between the importance of relationships and social harmony and indeed social stability. I mean, social stability was a big concern during the formulation of the philosophy, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. And that actually may be where I part ways with Confucianism. You know, I'm less concerned about social stability and more concerned about, again, like the quality, integrity of specific relationships. You know, social stability, you know, I'm wary of it just because of the ways in which a certain kind of rigidity or dogmatism or ideology may, you know, be introduced in the back door.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and as for the Christianity, maybe one question is, well, you could ask it in either direction. What does the Confucianism add that might not be there in Christianity more generically? Or on the other hand, what does the Christianity add that Confucian upbringing alone wouldn't have brought you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I came to Christianity because, or the Confucianism addresses a lack in Christianity for me. If anything, it's hard for me to imagine one without the other. Mm-hmm. Truth be told, the Christian ethic, from Matthew of we serve the least of us, animates me every day and everything that I think about, and I think that element, that ethos, is an important tonic to any sort of hierarchy that might be introduced from Confucianism, right? Mm-hmm. And again, like the version of Confucianism that I live, and I don't say advocate, but I live, is not predicated on hierarchies. It's predicated on respect. And the kind of deep humility one finds in Christianity, or at least the version of Christianity that I live, right? That is in the world but not fully of the world, right? This kind of Pauline sentiment that does not accept the world as is, particularly in regard to the injustices that we find so pervasive. Confucianism, you don't have the kind of agitating, dissenting, critical sensibility.
No, right? Quite the contrary. Classically, I would think. Right?
That's right.
I mean, I would think there's almost a little tension involved in being a Christian and a Confucian. A Christian in the sense you've described it, yep. and a Confucian at least in the classical sense.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I don't consider myself particularly orthodox in either regard. And so, I sometimes refer to myself as a New World Confucian. And minimum a kind of not a heterodox Christian, right? Mm-hmm. But a progressive one, Mm-hmm. Well, and and in this day and age, one might actually say that that's pretty heterodox.
Right. Although I would say, as a visiting professor at Union, neither the heterodoxy nor the progressivism has made you feel lonely there.
Fair enough. Well, and Union is one of the great centers for those traditions.
Right. So, is this a thing that's kind of happening? I mean, a fusion of Confucianism and Christianity. There's a lot of fusion going on these days in the modern globalized world. There are, in fact, people at Union who are doing work on Christianity and Buddhism. Mm-hmm. Is there a kind of a movement developing, or do you feel that there at least is a larger community you're part of by virtue of having ties to both Christianity and Confucianism?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to talk about fusions, right? Because it presupposes that one resides prior to these elements coming together. And again, I think...
Would eclecticism be better?
No, but I guess what I'm saying is that there's a certain kind of, how do we put it? A certain kind of synthetic identity that emerges, right? A synthetic spiritual identity, right? Where it's not just the admixture of standalone traditions. Mm-hmm. But even those, when we talk about Christianity, or we talk about Buddhism, or we talk about Confucianism, each of those are incredibly complex phenomena.
And variegated. I mean, there is no one. Exactly, there is no one version of them. Exactly.
And so, is there a movement? I would leave that to the theologians, mm-hmm. right? To kind of make those determinations. For me, they come together in ethical practice. They come together in political life. They come together in, again, new forms of sociality. I would. Yeah, I don't know that I would be the person to say mm-hmm. that there's this what was the word you used? The fusing of religious traditions that are constituting a movement. Mm-hmm. And again, I would leave this to folks who have or have a higher pay grade than I do.
But you've met other people with this combination of affiliations?
Oh, sure. So I'm Korean American. The thousands and thousands and thousands of Korean Americans, Korean American Christians, for example, it wouldn't be very hard at all to convince them or alert them to the Confucianism in their own upbringing. Now, many of them would say, well, I'm not going to identify with Confucianism, right? Because, I think most folks will say, I am of one religious tradition, right? I don't know that there are many, or I don't know that there's a lot of cultural currency for people to feel affirmed in to say that their religious identity is multiple, right? As you say, variegated.
Although that is more common in Asia than in the West. I mean, the Abrahamic religions are exclusivist. Certainly, particularly Christianity and Islam, I guess. But that is to say, you're supposed to not have any other religious affiliations, as they are classically understood.
Right, and I think the trick there is the word affiliation. And so you might find more variety if you ask people about identity rather than affiliation, where affiliation is tied to some kind of membership, social institution, and so on.
So on this point again about the kind of fine line maybe between philosophy and religion, the sense of the sacred, I thought I heard you suggest that it goes beyond the sacredness of social obligations and social ties and social duties. And extends to a connection with what we would normally consider the inanimate world. Is that right? Or at least beyond the human sphere to begin with. I mean, nature beyond the human sphere.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And excuse me. For me, there is a certain importance in being open to mystery, right? Or at least a humility in regard to not fully understanding and comprehending the nature of the reality or cosmos, right? I think one of the ways in which you talked about secularism earlier today, right? One of the which modern secularism de-animates many spiritual practices or many spiritual sensibilities is in the sense of we need to control and know everything, or at least in principle we will be able to control and know everything, and so. When I say a kind of openness to mystery, it is a kind of openness to saying there's much that we don't know, right? And, I don't feel like I detect a lot of humility in our culture, right? I don't feel like I detect a lot of humility in regard to knowledge, in regard to politics, in regard to morality. And humility is tied to this it's Confucian, it's Christian, it's Buddhist, of making space for others. Right? When we enter full force and say, well, I know, right? I know the truth, or at least in principle, I will be able to know these things. It forecloses space, right? And excludes. And for my kind of sensibilities, I feel like that's not. That's a social sensibility. That's a kind of antipathy to the kind of spiritual flourishing that I'm really working to fight against.
Mm-hmm. So another way of saying that maybe is there's a lot of fundamentalism around, not just in the conventional religious sense. I mean, there's a lot of fundamentalist ideology around. There's just a lot of self-certainty and intolerance, and I'm not claiming that I'm innocent of this myself, but just by labeling it.
Look, I fall short on this all the time, right?
Yeah, it's human. I mean, but by the same token, yeah, it would be good to struggle against it, I guess. So do you think? I mean, the other thing that I would say about the modern world is, at least superficially, the sense of duty is not as robust as it might have once been in American culture. Now, that may be a superficial and misleading reading, but I think it's safe to say that it's not just because I'm a person my age that I'm, starting to imagine that there was once a golden age.
Age conversation, Bob?
What's that?
Are we going to have that men of a certain age conversation?
Well, Probably not, actually. Probably most people listening would rather we didn't. So, but you know, I acknowledge.
But your point about duty and obligation is well taken, right? And then again, it connects to what we were talking about earlier in regard to relationships and Confucianism, right? You know, I'm often struck by the ways in which not even just young folks, like people I see, don't have a ready regard and respect for elders, right? Mm-hmm. You know, that was a.
We are having that men of a certain age conversation. It sounds like.
We are.
So
no, well, but you know, like for me, like this is a baseline way of being in the world. Mm-hmm. If you've been on the planet longer than I have, you've made it a bit farther than I have. You know, you're due some respect, right? Now, it's not an uncritical respect. Like if you start spewing racism at me, if you start spewing a certain kind of degradation of various forms of humanity, I'll still open the door for you. However, I will also engage you critically, right? I don't want folks to confuse deference with, you know, a blanket acceptance of elders. You know, but having said that, you know, it goes the other way too. Right, that there has to be a respect and acknowledgement of where young folks are at. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, we silverbacks have a certain kind of impatience for the young, as opposed to saying like, oh, so what was it like when I was 16 or 19 or in my 20s? You know, what did I not know?
Yeah. It's funny. You get emails from young people and you think, what are they thinking? And then every once in a while, I'll remember something I did as a college student or even after college that just was so astoundingly clueless. Not just in the sense of classically reckless bad judgment, like driving too fast or something, but just like, how could I not understand what was going on in the mind of the person I was dealing with? Or how could I not understand what they were expecting?
That's right.
And so you do have to remind yourself that, you know, wisdom accumulates slowly.
Well, but it, you know, goes back to the hubris and the arrogance that we referred to earlier, right? You know, that humility isn't something that's comes quickly or naturally to the young. You know, it needs to be taught. And here, you know, disciplines and, you know, rituals of reverence and respect are important. They're part of the cultivation of character. But having said that, you know, there are plenty of folks I know my age, our age, and say, well, you know, I know what I know, and you know, they're again, like, you know, you know, you use the right word about wisdom, you know, this kind of know-how of being in the world. But again, you know, I don't detect kind of a widespread set of practices around humility, around graciousness. Let's use the word graciousness, right? Mm-hmm. You know, if we were going to start a movement around graciousness, I'd be with you.
Okay, well, let's start the Church of Graciousness. We'll call it Grace Memorial. No, there's already a Grace Memorial Church. Never mind. One more question about Confucianism before. Well, actually, one asterisk about another thing to keep in mind about young people is they're working in a different technological environment. Like a few years ago, I noticed that like young people feel freer than my generation felt to tell you to show up late for stuff and so on. And you can take that as a sign of disrespect. But then I realized they have these technologies that allows them to notify the person. So it's not like the person is just left hanging. They can text the person and say, I'll be 10 minutes late. Also, the person has a form of entertainment in their smartphone. They can do work. So it's, you know, I think to some extent, some of these things that I don't necessarily love about young people are, in a way, natural adaptations to a new technological landscape. I don't know. Right,
but you know, note what your frustration is about. It's, you know, not just a lack of respect, but again, a lack of regard. And I'll use the term reciprocity again, right? So if you have a kind of reciprocating mindset, consciousness, you'd be quite self-conscious about being late, even if you notified somebody, right? Or saying like, you know, I'm taking your time, you know, or you took the care to make an appointment with me, to schedule, take time out of your day to meet with me, right?
Yeah. No, you're preaching to the choir. I mean, everyone who knows me certainly knows me well, and my family knows that it is a real, it's a real hobby horse of mine that people do not do a good enough job of putting themselves in the shoes of the people they're dealing with. I mean, even things like just bad software design drive me completely nuts, because it's like, no, not everyone is an engineer at Microsoft. That's not who your product is for. It just, when people fail to do the perspective-taking thing, for some reason, it's just always driven me completely nuts, even though I fail myself sometimes.
Well, but, so Bob, the flip side of that is generosity, right? We're all human. We all fail, right? I mean, apps aside, or, platforms aside, but if you take one word from that sphere of iterations, right? We make attempts, and with every attempt, we're most likely going to fail. We're not always going to be successful, but imagine a culture where we're generous with each other about our failures, right? A certain kind of patience that comes with respect. Yeah,
no, sign me up. I'm in favor of I'm in favor of this, and I'm in favor of reducing my own rate of failure in this regard. And I mean, that's in a way, what religions and spiritual traditions are about, is reducing people's rates of failure at various things like this,
or to have care and compassion for the fact that we are constantly failing.
Yeah, and it's a fine line between beating yourself up too much about it and ignoring the problem altogether.
Yeah.
So I said here's the final question about Confucianism I said I was going to ask a few minutes earlier. There is, at least in traditional Chinese religion, this word for heaven. It's Tian, I think it is. It's sometimes rendered Tian, and it's, on the one hand, often used as an example of how kind of Eastern spirituality has a less anthropomorphic conception of the divine. It's heaven. It's not like a god called Yahweh or something. On the other hand, the Chinese character that represents heaven, if you trace it back into ancient times, and it still kind of resembles a person, but if you trace it back to ancient times, it seems pretty clear it was a person, right? I mean, what is the status of this notion of heaven? Does it have an explicit role in Confucianism, and what else? Anything you have to say?
Well, I mean, I'm going to be humble in regard to what I say about this, right? Just in terms of the figure that you spoke of. I think it represents as much the humanity that resides in the cosmos, in heaven, as opposed to the anthropomorphizing of heaven itself.
Okay.
Right? So that, again, my teacher, Dui Ming, used to talk about the concentric circles, that are the framework for Confucianism. So the individual, brotherly or sisterly relationships, parents, family, and so on, that radiate out to heaven, right? But the radiation is that, we're all contained within that larger cosmic reality. And again, these words like cosmic or cosmos, heaven, they're metaphors. For what? Wholeness, for what? I don't want to use totality, but a sense of greater whole.
Okay. The and it does have a role in Confucian thought, the role in this heaven thing.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, but not as salvation,
right?
Not as afterlife.
Right.
It's something that we're constantly participating in, and constantly being constituted by and constituting.
Okay, so let's move on and talk a little about love. As I said, you taught a course with Cornell West this semester called Radical Love. You also, I learned from the World Wide Web, are working on a book called The Public Life of Love.
Indeed.
I don't know how much of a connection there is between the two, but for starters, can you tell us what radical love means? What's an example of radical love?
Oh, so radical love is related to what we're just talking about regarding the kind of relationships that we're trying to cultivate. So radical love, speaks to the ways in which forms of care, compassion, mercy are disruptive, right? That there's so much of our broken humanity that is unattended to. And so one of the, let's call it the kind of primary principles of radical love are to disrupt the conditions that maintain the brokenness of our humanity. So, for example, if I am suffering, or we encounter someone suffering from poverty, or experiencing some form of degradation, what is it to step out of our everyday common lives and to say, I'm going to attend to you in a fully present way? Now, radical love also takes expression from, great freedom movement. So, one of the probably the first 2 or 3 weeks in the course with Cornell, we spent a long time talking about King, Martin Luther King Jr. King being, arguably the great articulator of radical love in the 20th century. Not just in regard to the civil rights movement or the pronouncement of the beloved community that could be expanded and expounded, in the face of injustice. But, in regard to nonviolent resistance, in regard to arguing for the humanity of a people who had been systematically brutalized and degraded, for centuries.
Mm-hmm. So, part of it, in some of these cases, it's radical in the sense that you just are not normally inclined to do it. It's just much easier to walk past a homeless person,
sure,
even than to give them money. Much less to do more than that and actually stop and say, anything.
Or stop and say, who are you?
Yeah.
How are you? Right?
Mm-hmm.
How did you get here?
And it's, the thing about truly radical love is you literally don't have time for it. Not enough hours in the day. Leave aside the fact that we all have to make a living and somebody like you has to sustain a position that allows you to talk about radical love in a way that there will be somebody listening to you. Mm-hmm. It's a hard thing.
It is a hard thing, but let's step back a second and think, well, so what kind of lives have we constructed such that it is not a natural impulse to give love a high priority? Mm-hmm. Think about the phrase you just used and said, well, I have to make time for love, right? So what is it that we're making time for such that, love is not an afterthought, right? But something that is not a part of our everyday lives. Or at least explicitly so, right? Mm-hmm. And this relates to the Public Life and Love book. This got me, this phenomenon, where people are deeply invested, obviously, in love, and yet don't have a language for it, don't sort of fully understand, or don't feel overly self-conscious about talking about it, particularly in public life. Mm-hmm. Right? I thought this felt like a paradox that needs to be interrogated.
Mm-hmm. It also strikes me love doesn't naturally fill my heart in all situations. Let me say, in other words, it's not like, speaking as someone who's written about evolutionary psychology, it's not like it's natural to love everyone.
Right.
It takes work, and it's natural to dislike certain people depending on how they've treated you.
Right.
So I'm just imagining, getting, when you see a homeless person, just what kinds of disciplines it might take to get to a point of feeling love. I wouldn't expect it to just naturally happen with people.
Sure.
Right? And I know maybe that's what spiritual traditions are about, and that's what sermons are about and daily spiritual regimens are about and so on, but it seems to me that's like, if you really want radical love to become more common, you have to address the very difficulty of it.
Absolutely. So when I said radical love is disruptive, right? The encounter with the homeless person and the encounter with, the other, again, is not one in which you feel ready affection. radical love isn't necessarily about ready affection. Right? Mm-hmm. Radical love, it's radical because it's saying, well, what is it to find oneself in a love relationship with someone you would not normally feel connected to, not even just the other in regard to, say a homeless person or impoverished person or something, but, one's enemy, mm-hmm. right? And so what is it to extend one's heart, one's spirit, one's soul to the absolute other? That is a very complicated proposition, right? And so what does it require? It requires, as you referenced disciplines. It requires certain kinds of disciplines of sensibilities. In some ways, there are these kind of episodic moments of radical love, mm-hmm. which are easier, right? Kind of recognition of the humanity of somebody else, mm-hmm. right? And you think, well, what follows from that? Like, can we pursue a life dedicated to radical love after that, that kind of episodic moment, mm-hmm. where we're going to build something together? We're going to, and again, we use this term relationship. We're going to cultivate a relationship that is not "quote unquote" natural.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know in Buddhism or some kind of Buddhism, there's a kind of meditation called loving kindness meditation that aims to cultivate this kind of thing. Are there techniques, so to speak, in Christianity and/or Confucianism that aim at the same thing?
Sure. I mean, we just talked about Matthew, right? That is about a certain humility, but also an imperative of love that one receives from Christ. Confucianism, again, like the filial piety and the reciprocity one experiences both. Let's use the metaphors of horizontally and vertically, right? That those everyday practices, as they were, get one ready. I mean, because if you talk about the cultivation of habits, this could be Aristotle, this could be Confucian. It's to get one ready. It's to make sure that there's a certain kind of readiness of character and disposition and temperament, right? And here, that word temperament, I think, is an important one in regard to radical love, right? A kind of openness, a kind of capacity for presence. Again, and humility is a really important one here, mm-hmm. right? We were talking about graciousness earlier, right? To make space for that other because you're not filling the space with your own concerns and needs first.
And also humility in the sense of, there but for the grace of God. The
sure.
understanding sure. that given, a certain set of circumstances of birth, you could have been any other person.
Absolutely.
By the way, on Confucianism, there actually, I think, is at least one ancient Chinese philosopher who was more radical on the radical love front, right? Now, wasn't Mencius
sure.
more a preacher of truly universal love in a way that people of his era found too radical? Some people.
Well, I mean, so the great divide is often between Mencius and Xunzi, right? That so there are different conceptions of human nature. Mm-hmm. Right? Mencius says that we are by nature good, and Xunzi says not so much, mm-hmm. right? The great mention story of, well, if we see a boy sitting on the edge of a well and he falls in, right? We would all try to reach into the well and save the boy. Mm-hmm. The flip side of that, Xunzi is saying, well, if we're in a boat, someone falls off, and there's only one space left in the boat, we'll take the boat for ourselves, mm-hmm. right? So self-interest, mutuality, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's more of for myself, I think it's more of a combination of both. Most of us are probably predisposed to self-interest and self-regard. And if anything, what the various spiritual traditions we find ourselves cultivating is to say, well, how do we not just curb that, but account for that element of our humanity, mm-hmm. such that we can extend it. Again, here's the language of radical love. We can extend our humanity to others such that we elevate the humanity of others. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mentioned that you're writing a book called The Public Life of Love. Yep. I assume that is connected to this. Is there anything you want to say about this, or are you of the philosophy that when you're working on a book, the less you say about it, the better?
Well, I don't know, the less I say, I think there's much more for me to say. It's one of these projects where it feels both simple and extremely complex and ambitious. Right? And I think part of what I'm trying to do is to establish sort of what kind of audience there is for this, not in terms of marketplace, but in terms of sort of what is the hunger out there to talk about love in public life, right? And I think there is a deep hunger, but again, part of the trick here is to say, well, to convince people that there is a space, but also to help find a kind of collaborative way towards a language to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, your published book, Melancholic Freedom, published by Oxford University Press. Mm-hmm. You want to talk a little about that? I mean, for starters, what's the difference between melancholic freedom and existential angst? I mean, existential angst, I gather, is also rooted in a recognition of freedom, right? Sure. And the very grave responsibility that brings. Yeah. What is there anything you want to say about? Well, you choose whether you start out by defining melancholic freedom or what. Sure.
I mean, I can say something brief about the existential element first. Mm-hmm. So when I often talk about angst, I'll talk about that moment in Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety, where he distinguishes between fear and anxiety or angst. Mm-hmm. He says, fear, when we experience fear, we have a definite object in mind or before us, right? It may be authority, it may be violence, and whatnot. Kierkegaard says, angst is different. We don't know what the object is. But that the kind of uncertainty, as it were, the ambiguity one experiences angst, Kierkegaard says, is an index of our freedom, right? It reveals to us that we're free at this moment, right? Not just of choice, but of the conditions and possibilities of freedom. Melancholic freedom is a phrase I used, or coined, I guess, to talk about the condition of contemporary, or the fate of contemporary freedom, by which I mean, particularly in the American context, in a post-civil rights era, where one might argue that there were great successes rendered. And yet, in the wake of that, there were questions, particularly, so the book was written in the 90s, okay? Particularly when the sense in which, well, are there still great liberatory movements to take part in, such that we can envision and embody freedom? What I was finding at the time was that there was a reversion to this language of agency, right? So that agency became the site in which people were localizing their freedom. And I was pursuing this intuition where agency felt like a diminished form of freedom.
So agency, right, in the sense of free will?
Free will, the capacity to envision oneself as an actor in the world that induces change, particularly in regard to one's identity. This is, of course, fundamental and important, but again, it isn't a robust freedom, right? It isn't a robust part of it is an element of things like, social movements, but it's not, the full-blown thing.
And what does it lack?
Well, it lacks, that's a great question, right? It lacks a deep sense of solidarity. It lacks deep sense of rootedness and value. Lacks, and not always, but often lacks a sense of higher purpose and value and principles. Or one might say a sense of greater good. Right.
This sounds a little, maybe this is a reach, but like it has a little bit of a Confucian critique of a Western conception of freedom in it.
Sure. Yeah, there are elements of that, no doubt. And the reason that the melancholic, the modifier there, right, is the ways in which agency doesn't say freedom is dead, but it's not fully accessible, right? So if you remember Freud's definition of melancholy, it says it's the inability to mourn a love, right? So if we love a sense of the good, say grounded in social justice. We love a sense of the good and grounded in a sense of a fuller humanity for folks. And yet we don't realize freedom through that and revert again, like to this individualized, atomized agency. It's not to give up on that conception of freedom, but it's to say, I am in this blue space, this funk space, this melancholic space. Not willing to mourn it, not willing to let it die. But it's a kind of liminality, as it were.
So melancholic freedom is a kind of, if not unguided freedom, a freedom under insufficient guidance in a certain sense. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's a nice way of putting it. Insufficient guidance, but also efficient, let's say, partners, right? Right. Insufficient forms of sociality, insufficient forms of morality and ethics. Mm-hmm. Where again, the part of this is in the wake of and let's call them the varieties of secularism, right? Where it's not removing religion from the world, but it's diminishing the standing of various religious ways of being in the world. Mm-hmm. That agency is on the one hand an elevation of certain form of our humanity, a certain form of let's call it criticism and critique, but it asks the question of at what cost.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you mentioned the term higher purpose. Now, to a lot of people in the West, that would mean a purpose imparted by a divinity and even a divine being, possibly in a somewhat anthropomorphic sense. Do you mean higher purpose in a different, less specific sense, or?
I do. I mean it more in regard to principles and values than about a sense in which it's handed down by, again, like a divine.
So locating your purpose in the larger social order or in the larger social community, for one thing, and not entirely manufacturing it yourself independent of that web.
Yeah. I mean, look, I mean, as a professor of religious studies, right, I teach young folks about the various struggles for both finding and losing meaning. And the losing is an important element here, right? One could argue that the sheer variety of sources of possible meaning that we have access to now. We talk about the internet, but just the access to global cultures, right? On the one hand, is an incredible boon, right? Look at what I can encounter, the people I can encounter, the traditions, the cultures, the practices, and so on. But one says, well, how does one choose if we're not already grounded in a tradition, right? Or how does one, participate in a robust tradition of meaningfulness, not necessarily meaning making, but meaningfulness? If people are so scattered in regard to their spiritual attentions.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You must encounter this in your own work, right?
In the sense of.
Well, in the sense of kind of the ways in which, whether it's evolutionary biology or your own interest in secularism and skepticism and science and spirituality, the ways in which, science unhinges people, right, and yet connects them otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I'm really trying to think about and think through. And actually, it leads me to ask you. I mean, is Confucianism particularly well suited to a scientific age, and the is there less conflict between the foundational belief structure of that and science than seems to be the case with at least some Western religions as commonly interpreted?
When you say the scientific age, you mean the culture of experimentation, the corroboration by evidence?
Well, or the idea that certain conceptions of the divine, or say a highly interventionist God, seems to start seeming less plausible in a scientific age, or Or to some
because
people,
of certain kind of commitments to positivism and empiricism, that kind of thing.
And some people would say the notion of a soul is less plausible, although I think that, anyway, there's various kinds of things people say about tensions between science and Western religion.
I know. And I guess, that your take on this is sophisticated enough to say that, this is not about absolutes, right? If I think about science as a set of, let's call them social practices, right? Where, and again, there's a paradox at the heart of it, where on the one hand you're seeking truth, on the other hand, you have to, one as a scientist has to operate with a certain kind of open-endedness, right? That one's conclusions will be thwarted. One's conclusions are open to criticism. One's conclusions are, the evidence one has, may be refuted by someone who comes up with better or counter evidence. So again, it comes back to this theme of humility that we were talking about earlier. So at that point, if you can talk about science in those terms, I think there's going to be less of at least a long-term conflict with most religions, right? If the battle for religious life and identity is about how one can inhabit it, again with one's full humanity in measure, then I think the conflict with science is overstated.
Okay. Well, thank you, and thanks for taking the time. We've covered a lot of ground. We could have covered a lot of it in more detail if time had permitted. So maybe,
of course,
you'll come back in the future and we'll do it again.
Would love to. Thank you, Bob.
Meanwhile, I'd say if there ever is a Church of Grace, I nominate you as the first ordained minister. Okay.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much for the time and for the invitation.
Thank you.
All right.